Okay, guys. So it says, this is the worksheet. It says we will be working on our DBQ skills the next 2 days of class before we begin our World War I unit. The way that we will do this is by practicing grading some example DBQs from your peers. If you watched the video, this video, I will walk you through how I graded the first example. You will then give the next example scores on the rubric. We will then discuss these examples in class tomorrow and look at the good as well as the room for improvement. The purpose of this assignment is that you are able to take what you have learned and apply it to your next DBQ in order to improve your scores. Quick reminder that these examples are from your peers. So whenever we're talking about them, yes, we can talk about what they needed to improve, but it should all be in respectful language. So we're going to go ahead, I'll read the first example, and then we'll go ahead and I'll show you how I grade it. In 1760, the Industrial Revolution started. The Industrial Revolution was a time where people were building and making things that made the world better. They started travel, and it was getting better and better. This time of the world was so important because they made traveling better. They made clothes better. They made lots of things just better. They started to build factories that were owned by very harsh people and cheap people. Okay, so when I'm looking at the Industrial Revolution, I'm noticing some things. It says things, it was getting better and better, made lots of things just better. Okay, this needs to be more specific, right? What types of things were they making? How were they making things better? People have always traveled. What about the Industrial Revolution changed the way people traveled, made lots of things just better? And then there's this really abrupt shift to the negative. Okay, there needs to be more of a gradual shift, right? They just made lots of things just better. However, it wasn't better for everyone, right? They also started to build factories that were owned by very harsh people and cheap people. That needs to be a more general transition. So let's look at the claim. The Industrial Revolution was positive for world history to a small extent because women and children were treated horrible in the small run, and the working conditions and pay were bad, and the pollution was terrible from all the factories. They started to grow and grow more as more factories were made. Soon it was way too crowded and people started dying from illnesses. So here, right, instead of small run, we would probably say short run, okay? So this claim isn't bad, right? We see that her two reasons are really going to be working conditions and pay were bad, and then pollution from all the factories was terrible. She also mentions, soon it was crowded. What was crowded? She's talking about cities, so you need to be specific. Cities were, lots of pollution and way too crowded. So I know that those are going to be her two pieces of evidence. They need to be something related to that. So evidence number 1. Document number 1 explains my reasons. Okay, first and foremost, no, get rid of all first person. Document 1 definitely explains my reasons. You could just get rid of that, okay? You could just say, so what I would say here instead is document 1 explains an event, an event that was happening in 1906, okay? There was no year that it was published. The author was a Japanese factory worker, and the purpose of doing the report was to have somebody answer questions of what happened while working, also to see how they were treated people. Okay, so this context is missing some important information, right? Document 1 was a government report. We do know that it was published in 1906, yet this person says that there was no year that it was published, right? And the purpose, it was an interview with a factory worker, okay? And it also says, purpose of doing the report was to have someone answer questions to see how people were treated. The purpose, right, of government report is to inquire on working conditions, right? Usually to create some sort of law. So this context isn't terrible, but it's definitely missing some of the key aspects of what the document is. This source is valuable because the person working there was interviewed. They worked there and knew what happened. This source is limited, though, because she could be over-exaggerating to try and make people believe that their life was terrible. Okay, this source is valuable because the person working there was interviewed. They worked there and knew what happened. I would just rephrase this, right, into something saying more like, this this source is valuable and reliable because the person who was interviewed worked in the factory and therefore had personal experience of what was going on. And then it says the source is limited, though, because she could be exaggerating to try and make people believe their life was terrible. She might do this because. So explain why. You can't just say, like, this person might be over-exaggerating without giving a reason why. Okay? Okay, evidence. Do you get scolded? We are taken to a room next to the office and are reprimanded there. We are also beaten, and until we show a change of heart, we are kept there in the dark for several days. Are you fed? No. So this is a good piece of evidence because I can see that it supports that working conditions were bad. It doesn't say anything about pay, but hopefully she explains that in her analysis. But this is a good piece of evidence to support that first reason in her claim. This piece of evidence shows the Industrial Revolution was positive for world history to a small extent because women and children were treated harshly. They were beaten and punished and were not fed while working. Okay, so this evidence does a good job at explaining the evidence. But the question isn't just about the Industrial Revolution in Japan. So this person needs to bring the evidence back out to big picture and general IR, right? So they were beaten and punished and they were not fed while working, right? This type of treatment not only happened in Japan, as the evidence shows, but happened everywhere that the Industrial Revolution had spread to, including Europe. Women and children who were working in these new factories were treated very poorly. The next thing that they need to do is they need to discuss cause and effect. Okay. The reason that this was taking place during the Industrial Revolution is because factory workers were looking to make the greatest amount of profit. They were hoping, or it cost a lot of money to create safe working conditions. Therefore, these women and children were treated very poorly in order for these business people to make the greatest amount of profit. In addition, there was no laws to protect these people. And then the last thing they need to do is convince reader that negatives outweigh the positives, right? So the next thing they could say is, even though there were many positive things that happened during or from the Industrial Revolution, the treatment that these women and children endured was not worth all the positives that we experience today. Our technological progress should not happen on the backs of working class people. And then boom, they've done all of it. Okay, so you have to do more than this. You have to talk about more than just the evidence, right? You're trying to convince the reader, and this is where you do it. Okay, next piece of evidence. I'm going to go a little quicker through the second part. Document 3 is another piece of evidence that supports my claim. Get rid of that. Okay? You could just say document 3 was found in a museum in Chicago. The document's purpose was to show how bad the working conditions were and why people keep getting sick. Document 3 wasn't really to show the working conditions, it was to show poor living conditions in large urban city during IR. Okay? Give name of museum, a specific name, discuss that it was an online article. This source is valuable because it explains what's going on. But it's limited because it's a secondary source. Okay, so this one, the source is valuable because it's explaining what's going on. Why do we trust it? Going on where? Why is the fact that it is secondary a limit? Okay, so lots of questions. Each year from 1871, and I'm not going to read this whole thing, blah, 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 but it does do a good job at explaining her second reason in her claim, where it says pollution from the factories and cities getting bigger and people dying from illnesses. So this is a good piece of evidence to support her claim. This piece of evidence shows the Industrial Revolution was positive for world history to a small extent because it tells you how bad the working conditions were and how bad the cities were getting overcrowded. They also said stuff about the ashes and the tugboats and railroad made the air polluted. Once again, bring out to the big picture of the Industrial Revolution. Explain why the Industrial Revolution caused this, and then explain why this negative consequence was not worth all the positives of the Industrial Revolution, because that is ultimately what this person's trying to convince me of. This shows that the Industrial Revolution was positive for world history to a small extent because women and children were treated horrible, and in the small run, the working conditions and pay were bad. The pollution was terrible from all the factories. They're starting to grow and grow. Okay, this is just repeating her claim. Conclusion should not just repeat claim. Summarize major ideas in new way. Connect to importance of topic, okay? So let's go ahead and look at the rubric now, and I'll explain to you why I gave it the scores that I did. So for the thesis and the claim, I gave this person a 4, okay? They did a good job. Their claim is good. They have 2 clear reasons. It's not a 5 though. It's not a 5 though because it wasn't very complex, didn't have a counterclaim, anything like that. Jeez Louise, I can't highlight. So for this one, it is given a 4. Evidence. For the evidence, I actually gave them a 5 because both of their pieces, oh my gosh, wow, highlighting hard today. Both of their pieces of evidence do a good job at explaining and supporting the 2 reasons that they laid out in their claim. For source evaluation, I gave them I can't highlight, but I gave them a 2.5 out of 5. Okay, the reason is because, especially in that second piece of evidence, right, they don't really explain why it's reliable. It just says, this is valuable because it explains what's going on. Why do we trust it? Why do we believe what it has to say? In addition, they said because it's limited because it's a secondary source. Okay, why is that a limit? I also took off some points because their evidence context, it missed out on explaining, some of the purposes of the document, what the documents were, and so they were missing some important information there. For the analysis, I gave them a 3 because they attempted to analyze, but they were missing some really important parts. Missing cause and effect, missing connection to big picture industrial revolution, and missing a part of analysis where author convinces reader of argument, right? I'm not convinced after reading this DBQ that the negatives outweighed the positives of the Industrial Revolution. I see that negatives happened, but they don't convince me that the negatives were more important than the positives. Style, I gave a 3 because, as I was reading, you could kind of see there were parts where I was kind of like stuttering because of, lack of sentences, different things like that. There were some errors and conventions, but it didn't impede my ability to read it. And then the conclusion was attempted, right? Because the conclusion was really just a repeat of the claim. There was no new way of phrasing, no connection to the importance of the topic, nothing like that. They also used first person. This is where I will take off points if you use I, me, we, us, things like that. And then in terms of historical content, I also gave a 3. Their introduction was very vague in terms of what was going on during the Industrial Revolution. And then in the analysis, it's missing that cause and effect. I don't really see that this person understands why the Industrial Revolution caused all these things. I need to see that they know more about the Industrial Revolution. So if I'm thinking of what they did well, this person's evidence matched and supported their claim well. Claim had 2 solid reasons that were supportable with the documents. And then I would say another good area was all aspects of outline were filled out correctly, which means they had a good organization, right? So when they were supposed to put the evidence context, they did. When they were supposed to put the evidence, they did. Areas to improve upon. I would think that this person could definitely improve on source evaluation. Need to explain why the sources are reliable. If we're thinking about the type of document, the authors of the document, the time the document was written, okay? Also explain limits. If you're going to say it's a limit that it's a secondary source, you need to tell me why you think it's a limit, because sometimes secondary sources are positive. Analysis, cause and effect, big picture, and convince me. Okay, that is all for that, guys. You're going to go ahead and go through example 2 on your own, fill out the rubric, and don't